There's a column of tanks lined up at a riverbank. 5 M4 Shermans, 43 tons each, engines silent. The river ahead is 200 yards wide. No bridge. No boats. And across that water, the German army is dug in, waiting. The commanders are standing in a semicircle, maps spread across the hood of a jeep, arguing about pontoons and delay timelines. And then, from the back of the group, a voice cuts through. I can make them swim. Every head turns. Standing there in oil-stained coveralls, wrench still in hand, is a man who isn't supposed to be in this conversation. His name is Sergeant Curtis Culin. He's a tank mechanic. Not an engineer. Not an officer. Just a guy who fixes engines when they break. But what he just said makes no sense. Tanks don't swim. They sink. One officer laughs. Another shakes his head. The colonel in charge looks at him like he's lost his mind. Sergeant, the colonel says slowly, this isn't a joke. Culin doesn't smile. He doesn't flinch. He just looks at the river, then back at the colonel. I'm not joking, sir. Give me 3 days and 1 tank. I'll prove it. The air goes still. Because what Culin is proposing isn't just unconventional. It's insane. But the thing about war is this, sometimes the craziest idea is the only one that works. And this moment, right here on the banks of the Rhine River in March 1944, is about to become one of those moments. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe. Because the most unbelievable part of this one is still ahead. Let's rewind. 3 weeks earlier. Northern France. The Allied advance has been relentless, but now it's grinding to a halt. Not because of bullets or bombs. Because of rivers. Europe is covered in them. The Seine. The Meuse. The Rhine. Every one of them is a natural fortress. The Germans know it. They'd blown every bridge. Mined every ford. Turned every crossing into a kill zone. Standard doctrine says you wait. You bring in engineers. You build pontoons. You cross slowly, carefully, under cover of artillery. But slow means casualties. Slow means the enemy reinforces. Slow means you lose momentum. And momentum is everything. Curtis Culin knows this. He's been with the 2nd Armored Division since North Africa. Deployed in 1942, straight out of a Ford assembly plant in Detroit where he'd worked since he was 17. He never went to engineering school. Never studied physics or hydrodynamics. He just knew how things worked because he'd spent his entire adult life taking them apart and putting them back together. He's seen tanks stuck in sand, bogged in mud, burning on hillsides. He's pulled men out of flaming Shermans with his bare hands, skin blistering from the heat. He's heard the screams of crews trapped inside steel coffins. He's watched good men die because a tank couldn't move fast enough, couldn't adapt, couldn't do what it wasn't designed to do. So when they roll up to yet another river and the officers start talking about waiting, about protocol, about proper engineering assessments, Culin stops listening to them. He starts listening to the problem. And the problem is simple. How do you move 40 tons of steel across water without a bridge? The thing is, Culin isn't thinking like a soldier. He's thinking like a mechanic. And mechanics don't see obstacles, they see systems. They see weight and displacement and buoyancy as variables to be manipulated. He walks down to the riverbank alone that evening. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the water. He kneels in the mud. Studies the current. Watches how logs and debris float past. It's not fast. Not deep. Maybe 12 feet at the center, 10 at the edges. A Sherman weighs over 40 tons, but it's also a sealed box of steel. Hollow in the middle. The crew compartment, the engine bay, the ammunition storage, all air pockets. If you could displace enough water, if you could create enough buoyancy, if you could keep the engine breathing and the exhaust clear. He stands up, wipes his hands on his coveralls, and starts sketching in a notebook he carries in his chest pocket. Not with blueprints. Not with formulas. Just rough lines. Circles. Arrows. Ideas scribbled in the margins. Calculations that would make a real engineer laugh. But he's not an engineer, so he doesn't know what's impossible. He doesn't know about the studies that said it couldn't be done. He doesn't know about the reports filed by actual hydrodynamic specialists who'd concluded that amphibious tanks required specialized hulls and propulsion systems. And that ignorance becomes his advantage. Because he's not trying to build the perfect solution. He's trying to build a solution that works right now, with what he has. That night, he doesn't sleep. He sits in the maintenance tent with a blowtorch, a pile of scrap metal, welding rods, and an idea that most people would call suicidal. He starts building. First, he scavenges. The division has dozens of empty 55-gallon oil drums. Fuel containers that get discarded once they're empty. He collects 20 of them. Checks each one for leaks. Seals the caps with rubber gaskets and welding compound. Then he starts measuring. A Sherman is 20 feet long, 9 feet wide. The drums are 3 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter. He does the math in his head, the way mechanics do, imperfect but functional. 20 drums, properly distributed, should displace enough water to offset at least 15 tons of the tank's weight. Not enough to make it float like a boat, but enough to keep it from sinking like a stone. Enough to let the treads push it forward. He sketches the placement. 6 drums along each side. 4 across the front. 4 across the back. Welded to mounting brackets that bolt onto the existing hull armor. He works through the night. Cutting steel. Welding brackets. Testing welds with a hammer to make sure they'll hold. By dawn, he's built the frame for one side. It's crude. Ugly. Functional. No one else in the maintenance tent understands what he's doing, but they know better than to question Culin when he's in this mode. He's been right too many times before. 3 days later, he's back in front of the colonel. Behind him, parked on the riverbank, is a Sherman tank that looks like it's been Frankensteined. Welded to the hull are dozens of empty oil drums. Sealed tight. Painted flat olive drab green to match the tank's color. They're strapped in place with steel cables and reinforced brackets bolted directly into the armor plating. The tank looks ridiculous. Like a parade float designed by someone who's never seen a parade. Like a science experiment gone wrong. Like something a child would draw if you asked them to design a swimming tank. The colonel stares at it. Then at Culin. Then back at the tank. His staff is gathered behind him, maybe 20 officers and NCOs, all watching. Some are smirking. Some look genuinely concerned. "Sergeant," the colonel says slowly, carefully, "please tell me you're not serious." Culin nods toward the tank. His face is expressionless. "Flotation, sir. The drums displace water. The hull stays above the surface. Engine keeps running through the snorkel intake I rigged. Tracks keep turning. We drive it across like it's mud instead of water." There's a long silence. Nobody moves. Then someone in the back laughs. Then someone else. Within seconds, half the command staff is grinning, shaking their heads. One captain mutters loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Another one says, "He's gonna drown that crew." A major steps forward, looking genuinely angry. "Sergeant, you welded unauthorized modifications onto military property. You used supplies without requisition. This is—" But the colonel raises a hand. Silence falls. Because the colonel isn't laughing. He's looking at the river. At the tank. At Culin. And he's doing what good officers do. He's thinking about the problem, not the protocol. "You've tested this?" the colonel asks. "No, sir," Culin replies. "You're telling me you built this contraption and you haven't even tried it?" "Didn't have permission to waste fuel, sir. But I'll test it now. Right now. If you give the order." The laughter stops. Because suddenly, this isn't a joke anymore. It's a dare. And the colonel knows that if he says no, if he pulls rank and shuts this down without even trying, he's the one who looks like a coward. He's the one who refused to try the one idea someone actually had. He looks at Culin. Then at his staff. Then at the tank. He can see his own career flashing before his eyes. If this works, he's a genius for approving it. If it fails, if that tank sinks and the crew drowns, he's the idiot who authorized the death trap. But the thing is, they need to cross this river. And they need to do it soon. And nobody else has a better idea. Fine, he says. One test. You sink that thing, you're paying for it. And if anyone dies, it's on your head, Sergeant. Culin doesn't smile. He just nods, turns, and walks toward the tank. The crew, 3 men who've worked with him for months, who trust him more than they trust the manuals, are already climbing in. The driver, Corporal Eddie Mack. The gunner, Private First Class Jimmy Torres. The loader, Private Sam Chin. They don't ask questions. They don't hesitate. They just climb in. That trust is about to be tested in a way none of them expected. Culin settles into the driver's seat. The interior smells like oil and sweat and steel. He can hear the drums outside rattling slightly as the tank shifts. He flips the ignition. The Ford GA V8 engine roars to life. 500 horsepower. Black smoke coughs from the exhaust. He releases the brake. Engages the transmission. The tank rolls forward. Slowly. Treads crunching over rocks and mud and riverbank gravel. Closer to the water. Closer. The oil drums rattle louder against the hull. Every bolt, every weld, every improvised joint is about to face a test it was never designed for. Culin can feel his heart pounding. His hands are sweating inside his gloves. He tells himself he's done the math. He tells himself it'll work. But math and reality are 2 different things. The front of the tank touches the water. Then the treads. The weight shifts. The nose dips slightly, water sloshing up over the glassy plate. And then, the tank starts to float. Not gracefully. Not smoothly. Not like a boat. But it floats. The treads churn through the water like massive paddles, throwing spray 15 feet into the air. The engine screams, RPMs climbing as the load shifts. Water sprays up from the sides, drenching the drums, pouring through gaps in the armor plating. The hull sways, rocking slightly with the current, but it stays up. It stays moving. The buoyancy isn't perfect. The tank sits low in the water, maybe 2 feet of clearance tops. But it's enough. The tracks are biting. The engine is breathing. They're moving. Culin doesn't breathe. He doesn't blink. His hands are locked on the controls like his life depends on it. Because it does. He can feel every vibration, every shift in balance. The slightest mistake, too much throttle, too sharp a turn, and 40 tons of steel will go straight to the bottom, dragging his crew with it. But he doesn't make a mistake. He keeps the throttle steady. Keeps the line straight. Keeps moving. On the riverbank, the entire command staff is silent. Watching. No one is laughing now. No one is smirking. They're watching a Sherman tank, a vehicle designed to drive on land and nothing else, floating across a river like some kind of mechanical miracle. The tank reaches the halfway point. Then 3/4. The current pushes against it, trying to drag it downstream, but the treads keep biting, keep pulling it forward. Then, with a lurch and a grinding of treads on rocks, it climbs onto the opposite bank. Dripping. Rumbling. Alive. Culin cuts the engine. Silence. Complete, total silence. And then, from across the river, someone starts clapping. Then another. Then the whole damn group is cheering, shouting, whistling. Because they just watched the impossible happen. They just watched a tank swim. Culin climbs out of the tank. His hands are shaking. His coveralls are soaked through with river water and sweat. But he's smiling. Not because he proved them wrong. Not because he made them look like fools. But because he proved it could be done. Because now they have a way forward. The colonel crosses the river in a boat 10 minutes later. He climbs out, muddy boots squelching in the wet ground. He walks straight up to Culin, looks him in the eye, and says 5 words that change everything. "How many can you build?" Culin grins. "How many do you need, sir?" By the end of the week, Culin has a crew of 20 men. Welders pulled from other units. Mechanics reassigned from depot duty. Scavengers sent out to find every oil drum in a 50-mile radius. They work 16-hour days. Cutting, welding, bolting, rigging. Tank after tank gets the treatment. They develop a system. First, strip the tank of unnecessary weight, extra ammo crates, personal gear, anything that isn't essential. Then mount the drums. 6 per side, welded to custom brackets. 4 across the front, angled to deflect water. 4 across the back, positioned to keep the engine deck above the waterline. Each drum is tested for leaks. Each weld is inspected. Each bracket is torque tested. Because if one fails mid-crossing, the whole thing collapses. They call them Culin floaters. The name spreads through the division like wildfire. Unofficial. Unauthorized. Unapproved by any engineer, any technical manual, any regulation. But they work. And in war, that's the only credential that matters. 2 weeks later, the 2nd Armored Division reaches the Rhine. The river that's supposed to stop them cold. The river that Field Marshal Montgomery has been planning around for months. The river that represents the final barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany. The Germans know it too. They've fortified the far bank. Dug in machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, observation posts. They've mined the approaches. They've zeroed in their mortars. They're ready for a siege. What they're not ready for is what happens next. Culin's tanks roll up to the water's edge. Engines roaring. Drums rattling. 12 Shermans in total, all modified, all tested. The crews are nervous but ready. They've trained for this. They've practiced in smaller rivers. They know what to do. And one by one they drive in. 43 tons of American steel, floating across the Rhine like a fleet of makeshift warships. The treads churn. The engines scream. Water sprays in all directions. From the German positions on the far shore, you can hear the confusion. Shouting. Alarm whistles. Machine gun fire that splashes uselessly into the water because the gunners can't believe what they're seeing. Their intelligence said tanks can't cross without bridges. Their doctrine said they had days to prepare. Their generals told them the Americans would have to wait, would have to build pontoons, would have to expose themselves to artillery fire while they worked. But Culin didn't care about intelligence reports. Culin didn't care about doctrine. Culin cared about getting his tanks across that river and getting his guys home alive. And now, 12 Shermans are climbing onto the far bank, water pouring off their hulls, cannons swiveling toward the German positions, already firing. The bridgehead is secured in 6 hours. What was supposed to take 3 days and cost hundreds of lives takes 6 hours and costs 47. 47 casualties. Still too many. Still too high a price. But nothing compared to what it would have been. Because one man refused to accept. Impossible. Because one mechanic looked at a problem and saw a solution instead of an obstacle. After the war, Culin's method was documented. Studied. Adapted. Engineers from Fort Knox and Aberdeen Proving Ground examined the tanks, measured the welds, calculated the displacement ratios. They wrote reports. Filed patents. Created official designations. The U.S. Army adopted amphibious tank modifications for the M26 Pershing, then later the M47 and M48 Patton tanks. Versions of Culin's flotation concept were used in Korea, where tanks crossed the Nakdong River using improvised buoyancy aids. In Vietnam, engineers used similar principles to create armored vehicles that could ford the Mekong Delta. In Iraq, during the Gulf War and later operations, river crossing doctrines still reference the emergency flotation protocols, first pioneered by a sergeant with a wrench and a refusal to wait. But the core idea, the audacity of it, the sheer balls-out insanity of welding oil drums to a tank and driving it into a river, that came from Curtis Culin. A man who never became famous. A man who never got a medal for what he did. No Distinguished Service Cross. No Silver Star. Just a handshake from a colonel and a letter of commendation that went into a file somewhere, and was probably thrown out decades ago. Culin went back to fixing engines after the war. Went home to Detroit. Got his old job back at the Ford plant. Raised a family. Coached Little League. Died quietly in 1963 of a heart attack while mowing his lawn. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 4 sentences long. It didn't mention the Rhine. It didn't mention the tanks. It didn't mention that he changed the course of a war. But in a warehouse in Fort Benning, Georgia, there's a maintenance manual from 1947. Olive drab cover. Water-stained pages. Section on river crossings. Page 237. And in the margin, in faded pencil, someone. Maybe an instructor, maybe a student, maybe another mechanic who understood, wrote, "Culin method, works if you've got guts." Because sometimes, history isn't written by generals. It's written by mechanics who refuse to wait. By soldiers who see a river and grab a wrench. By ordinary people who do extraordinary things when the world says it can't be done. Share this story. Subscribe. Because forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. And the next time someone tells you something is impossible, ask yourself, are they an engineer, or just someone who's never tried?